Bonjour tout le monde. Did I say that okay? I think I said it okay. Welcome to day 2. A nice day with no rain, I think, probably, hopefully so far. Thank you for coming to my talk. And thank you, API Platform, for having me back again, because I was here last year as well. But if you miss me, let's see if this clicker actually, yep. I'm Pauline. I'm a freelance software engineer, and I'm currently mostly working in the autonomous aviation space, so very non-web. My hobbies include knitting, video games, long walks on the beach, and making segues to the topic at hand, which brings me to the bright and exciting future of the decentralized web. So this is a topic that really, really excites me for a lot of reasons. I know that there's a few people who run this conference who are also very excited about it, hence the fact that I think there's 3 talks programmed into the schedule that have something to do with decentralized web anyway. But what does it mean for something to be decentralized? So if you read my talk description, you probably would have read that this is decidedly not a blockchain talk. And I feel like I have to give that disclaimer because the term decentralized has kind of, in recent years, become synonymous for blockchain and Web3 and stuff like that through this NFT hype and this crypto hype. But something doesn't have to be blockchain to be decentralized and vice versa. All that it means for something to be decentralized is that it's the opposite of centralized. Thank you, Clippy, very useful. So what does it mean when a system is centralized? Well, it just means that it's managed in one central place by one central entity, for instance. And it can also be that it's not the entire system that's centralized, but that it's part that's centralized. So it could be that in terms of like data storage or a computing power, administration, hosting. So that also means that a system can be partially centralized, but not completely. If we do a little callback to blockchain, a lot of people call blockchain a decentralized system because the transactions on the ledger are validated in a distributed way. But then if you take blockchain exchanges or crypto exchanges, which is where most people have their crypto, those wallets are managed in a central place. They're tied to your identity in a central place. So that part is centralized. So again, something doesn't have to be completely decentralized, and sometimes something doesn't have to be completely centralized. So inversely, in a decentralized system, you have multiple independent nodes that can communicate with each other, but they don't exert control over each other. So for instance, take Mastodon. Who here is on Mastodon? Okay. So Mastodon, most of you have probably heard of it even if you're not on it, but Mastodon is an application that can be run by different servers, and they run it independently. So one server is really an instance of Mastodon with its own users, with its own moderation rules and stuff like that, but you can still follow people on other servers, so other nodes in the decentralized system. Then there's another term that I want to discuss because it's often used kind of interchangeably with decentralized, but it doesn't mean exactly the same. This is a very not reliable clicker, I've come to find out. Anyway, and that term is distributed. So a lot of people use, again, decentralized and distributed interchangeably, but it's slightly different because distributed means something is spread out, and that's often in terms of like computing power. A distributed network will often share a task that is a very heavy task that it needs more resources to do. So for instance, one really big example of a distributed network or a distributed system is DNS, that we all probably know, or at least all of us have used it, whether we know it or not, because DNS is the system that maps domain names to IP addresses so that your browser knows that if you type in google.com, it goes to a specific IP address. And so that mapping is done by many, many name servers all across the globe, because it's a huge task, because it's, it's responsible for mapping all the web IP addresses in the world, essentially. So you need to do that on a distributed network rather than on one machine. So a distributed network can be centralized, but doesn't have to be. A network can spread out its resources but still be managed in the same place. So for instance, if you have a Kubernetes cluster, you're spreading out resources over these different machines so that you can horizontally scale your applications, but you are still the one that manages it. So it's a distributed system, but not a decentralized system per se. And now that we have those terms kind of defined, I want to take you on a journey through the past, the present, and the future of the web. Starting with 1989, because in 1989, Sir Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, with a few other people, of course, at CERN. And it was meant to be a distributed network for knowledge sharing. So there was really an ethos there that was, we want to be able to share knowledge with everyone around the globe, with people that traditionally may not have had access to this knowledge, either because they're under repressive governments or because they didn't have the means to go to university or buy books and things like that. So it was really a kind of a wholesome goal. And you can even see a very early logo for the World Wide Web under there that was made by one of his colleagues. And the slogan there says, "Let's share what we know." And it's very, I always want to put little rainbows, and it's very wholesome. So it was a new concept, but it was building upon already existing technologies, in particular 3 existing technologies. One of them was, personal computers. Another was networking, so connecting all those personal computers together. And then another one was hypertext documents. So the idea was to have these personal computers all across the globe be exposed to each other as servers, and then being able to hop from server to server as a client to see all these hypertext documents, and then through hyperlinks, click through to the next one, which might be on a completely different server, and so on and so forth. And you can still really see that mindset in Wikipedia, because that's still, it's not all on different well, I'm sure it's a distributed network, but it's not all personal computers in people's houses that are hosting it, of course. But you really still see that mindset of like clicking through hyperlinks to find information. So then it was unleashed upon the world, and it was a huge catalyst for the information age, the one that we're in now. And he was even knighted for it, as you can see by the Sir title in his name, which I hear he prefers not to use. But yeah, officially he is a knight for this. But a lot of people couldn't really set up their own personal computers as servers, so countless companies started popping up, offering small amounts of web space for people's personal homepages. So things like GeoCities started popping up, which I'm sure some of you will remember, and some of you may not remember. And it led to glorious internet culture, and it also led to awful internet culture, and a lot of personalized home pages, a lot of GIFs, with lots of useful information, but also lots of not so useful information. And then, yeah, people really started taking things into their own hands. So they started learning HTML. They started prodding at things. Some people started discovering that Internet Explorer had a feature called XML HTTP request, which turned into AJAX requests and dynamically loading data into their pages, which were previously static. And then, of course, Rasmus wrote PHP to be able to dynamically show information from his server on his personal web page, things like system time and stuff. And then that he just kept adding stuff on until eventually it was like you could talk to the database and things like that. And now we're all here. So that was kind of all happy accidents, but was never the point, really. But then things started going from these hypertext documents to applications, web applications. And people stopped hosting their little personal homepages, but they started joining bigger applications where they could communicate with their friends and post stuff and things like that, and didn't have to learn HTML. So that was quite fun. But pretty quickly, and if you were doing a degree like I was in the mid-2000s, late 2000s, then you would have started hearing big data as a buzzword. And at the time, that was like the new business model for the web. And I remember being taught that if I want to work in web, I need to be aware that I have to really store every tiny bit of behavioral user data that I can get my hands on, even if you don't really understand how some of these data points might be relevant. You never know. And there was no talk of, could it be concerning to store this data? There was barely any talk. Well, I say barely because, of course, there were some people that were concerned, like Robert Caillot, which is also the colleague that made that cute little logo before, so Tim Berners-Lee's colleague. And he said at the time, which was a lot more than users were thinking, the client is the advertiser. So you are not the client, the advertiser is the client, and you are the product. And you have no contract with them, meaning, they're making money off you, but you're basically signing your rights away without really realizing. I think something very similar is happening with AI right now, generative AI specifically. Like if you look at Hollywood, these protests in Hollywood now, a big part of that is the prospect of these production companies having infinite rights to actors' likeness, so they can infinitely produce content with these people's likeness and never pay them. So it's kind of a similar concern. But at the time, not very many people had this concern. I think most users were just like, okay, so you sell my data to advertisers, and then you show me some fun ads that I may want to buy stuff from. I'd gladly trade that for your service. So that's not really a concern. But what happened then is, because these kind of early internet companies started collecting most of the data, they were also collecting most of the wealth, meaning they could kind of start gobbling up all the new startups, social startup that started popping up, like famously Facebook bought Twitter, or Instagram, sorry. So that was a really big move. So they started hogging loads of data, so a lot of this data became centralized. So much so, in fact, that in 2018, 57% of all web traffic was going through FANG, so Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. And so what was meant to be this global distributed equal network, equalish at least, is becoming increasingly more centralized. And all of that has had very serious consequences far beyond the realm of advertising, which at the time is what the concern seemed to be. For instance, in terms of energy consumption, to store all this data that we have, the storage capacity to store all that data from 2018, so when they already controlled 57% of all the web's traffic, to 2020, tripled. So that's a lot. And then also, fun fact, one giant Google data center uses billions of liters of water every single year just to cool the servers to hold the data. And then they're often also built in very drought-prone areas like Arizona and things like that. So that's just one data center. And aside from energy consumption and environmental impact, the data is now being sold to much more nefarious ends than ads. For instance, it's used for mass surveillance, not just by your own government, but also other nation states. So other people's countries are also spying on you. And personas, so profiles, are created of us to, for instance, swing elections, so affect the political climate heavily, deliver meticulously targeted propaganda to our kids, and even incite hatred to the point of genocide. So these are all side effects that we didn't quite expect. Oh, I should have plugged in my laptop because it's now beeping at me that it's about to shut down. 1 second. Thank God there's sound in this presentation, otherwise I would have never heard the beep and it would have just shut off. Which, if you have a ThinkPad, you'll also know that sometimes they just don't turn on anymore if they... so that's very fun. So basically, Tim Berners-Lee obviously had very different intentions building the web. And in 2018, he posted an open letter warning people that his invention was no longer used for good. It had been perverted, abused, and it's been weaponized against us. So now you may say, but Pauline, this doesn't seem very bright and exciting at all. And it isn't. You would be right. But so far, I've only talked about the past and the present of the web. But this talk is about the future. And for the future, Tim Berners-Lee is starting a project that aims to flip the web the right side up again. I almost wanted to say no when they asked me if this presentation has sound, because I was like, I feel a little guilty that they're going through extra effort just for these sound effects. But anyway, this bold plan is called the Solid Project. Has anyone heard of this? Oh, wow. I don't remember putting that in on that slide, but that's fun. So nobody's heard of this? Oh, a few, okay. Because also last year at API Platform Con, there was a really good talk about the Solid Project by one of the main researchers of the project. So that was very cool to see. So the Solid Project, this name Solid, stands for Social Linked Data, so SOLID. And it's based on two different components, essentially. One of them is the solid spec, so the specification, which is based on linked data. So it's based on vocabulary that represents things from real life and online life, so person, address, comment, post, like, that sort of stuff. And then another component of it is pods. And pods are essentially servers, and the aim is that every web user will one day have their own pod to store their personal data and then expose that data to the outside world, so through apps, to apps that they use and things like that, through this specification. So that's the idea. So what that implies is that, for instance, that's your pod, a little personal computer. And you might be using a streaming service like Spotify, for instance, and then you have a subscription to that service, so it gets reads permissions to your name for your profile and your address for your billing address. And then in turn, it has write permissions to your pod for your listens and your favorites, so those get stored in your pod. And then let's say you're using another service that is an event calendar. It also takes your name and your city because it's used for recommending concerts and events in your area. And then it also has read permissions to your listens and your favorites that are written to your pod by, for instance, this streaming service, but also maybe other services that you might be using. They're all writing to the same object on your pod. So you retain the same value as what you would get from like tracking cookies and things like that. You can still get recommendations, but you have more control over your data. And for instance, another bit of added user value, because we all know that most users don't care all that much about privacy, that they're going to change everything that they do. But another added a bit of user value is that now if you change your address in your pod, this address change is propagated to everything that has read permissions for your address. So you don't have to update it in all these different services. So there's a bigger degree of interoperability between services that you use. And then also, let's say you cancel your subscription to a music streaming service that could be Spotify, then it doesn't need your billing address anymore, so you could just remove read access to your address, and then it will not have read access to your address. And I really find this a really a promising concept, because I find it a little depressing when I think about how much data, how much of a trail of data I've left out on the internet since I was a preteen. And that's just out there forever. You know, my deepest thoughts, photos of my friends, who my friends were in university, my embarrassing anime drawings that I did in high school, stuff like that is all out there forever. And I now have a 3-year-old kid, and I have noticed that I really dislike the idea of her becoming an internet user and then just leaving this trail of decades of behavioral data that they've accumulated from her. So I find this really promising. You can already, it's early days, but you can already get your own pod. There's a few options. There's not much you can do with the pod yet, but if you're excited about it like me, you can get one. So you can host your own, but that's not the most user-friendly, because just like with the World Wide Web at the beginning, it does entail running your own web server. So there are also some hosted options. So the GeoCities of the decentralized web, if you will. There is a community server that's hosted, so I have a pod there. I think UI-wise it's still a bit lacking, but contributions are very welcome. And then there's Inrupt, which offers an enterprise-grade pod. And Inrupt is the company that Tim Berners-Lee started to kind of finance this whole project and offer it to bigger organizations, especially governments and things like that. They're looking at, because it's still pretty hard to get venture capitalists to be interested in this sort of stuff, seeing as data is still worth a lot, even though it's a little unsustainable. But so Inrupt has closed 50 million in funding so far, probably maybe more by now actually. And the Flemish government, so your neighbors up north, is investing in a pod for every single Flemish citizen to manage their government data, like their address and things like that. And then the NHS, so the National Health Service in the UK, has also run a pilot in the Greater Manchester area. I don't know if that's still ongoing or if that's finished. There hasn't really been any updates, but it's quite interesting because they're using it for their patients' medical data, so that they keep that on their own hosted, but still their own pod. Oh, by the way, the concept is that even though you might be on a hosted pod, your data is portable as well. So if you don't trust whoever you're with anymore, you can take all your data and move it to a different pod whenever you like. So that's also quite nice. Oh, look, a pop-up. If you want to get your own pod, scan this QR code and it'll take you to the instructions on the Solid website. Another fun thing I want to talk about that we've already touched upon a little bit is the Fediverse. So who has heard of the Fediverse? A lot of hands. Wait, keep your hands up if you... Keep your hands up, and then put your hands down if you're not on Mastodon. Yeah, okay, so like I think that's like 80% of the people who know what the Fediverse is are on Mastodon. And that is not very surprising because Mastodon is by far the biggest Fediverse app that people are using right now with, in July, I think it was 10 million registered users. And that's because when Elon Musk bought Twitter, a lot of technologists, especially privacy-minded people and journalists and activists, didn't really trust that move and made an exodus to Mastodon. And since he's done some weird stuff, and there's been a few more exodi, not sure. But more and more people are moving to Mastodon because of this. I already talked a little bit about how Mastodon is set up, but it's a decentralized app, right, with all these independent nodes that communicate each other. So that is part of why it's federated. But Mastodon is not the only federated app. And all the apps in that are federated, the collection of those, we call that the Fediverse. So they're all an interconnected network of apps, basically. So what does federation mean? Well, like I said, Mastodon is set up as a decentralized network, right? But then there's also Write Freely, which is very similarly set up, but it's, instead of a microblogging platform, it is a blogging platform. So Write Freely is kind of a distraction-free blogging platform, so it doesn't work with likes or claps or anything like that. It's just a place where you go to write your stuff and put it on the internet. And it also is made up of all these different instances, these different servers, like Mastodon, and you can choose to join one server, but still follow people on another server. And this is where it gets very interesting, this thing, federation, which I think a lot of people don't realize, is that Write Freely and Mastodon use the same protocol called ActivityPub, which I think has been mentioned before at this conference already. But so ActivityPub is also a linked data vocabulary, also specifically for social. So they're both using this same protocol. And so let's say my mom is on Write Freely and I am on Mastodon, and my mom likes to blog about her cookie recipes. So she posts this cookie recipe on her Write Freely. Then I can go on Mastodon, I can enter her handle, and I can follow her. And then because a blog post on Write Freely is a note object on the ActivityPub protocol, and Toots, which is a post on Mastodon, also use the same note object. They're the same thing according to the protocol. So if I follow my mom on Mastodon, her blog posts are going to show up on my timeline, even though we're using completely different apps. And that's what I think is really unique and new, is it's not just, when people fled from Twitter, they thought they were looking for a Twitter clone. There's also a Reddit clone and some other clone-like apps. But the fun part about it is not necessarily that they're clones, but that it's a whole new way of sharing content. And I really like the fact that you don't have to go on TikTok to keep up with your nephews and nieces, and my mom doesn't have to go on Instagram to keep up with us. I think she's lost track and she's given up. Because everyone can just pick their own app and still keep up with each other, follow their own stuff, but just choose the medium that they want to do it with. So that's really, really fun. And then, by the way, there's also Blue Sky. Is anyone on Blue Sky? Okay, one. Hi, Blue Skyer. Is that Kevin? Yeah. So this doesn't surprise me. But so Blue Sky is also a federated app, although it's the only app on their protocol, and they have a different protocol that they wrote themselves, which is kind of unfortunate. They have their reasons to do it, but it did kind of disappoint me because it defeats the purpose of all being on the same protocol and having that interoperability, right? Okay, so the next thing I want to move on to is a little bit more towards the blockchain ecosystem, but that's not why I want to talk about it. It's called IPFS, and it stands for Interplanetary File System, which is already enough reason to check it out, to be honest. And it's a peer-to-peer file sharing system, a bit similar to torrenting, but it's also a protocol. If you notice this IPFS : // that reminds you a bit of HTTP, right? And that's because it's meant to be a protocol like HTTP, where you can access resources through your browser. And Brave, for instance, if you're using Brave, that natively supports it. I almost have to sneeze. Okay, I think we're good. So Brave supports it. And then there's browser extensions for other browsers, like at least Firefox and Chromium that you can install, and then it also supports it. So the idea is that you can access resources through this IPFS protocol, but it's hosted peer-to-peer. So the content, the resources that you're looking for are chunked up into many different parts, and then these peers on this network are hosting just the chunks, and the chunks of data are hashed and then hosted, and then with a CID, a content identifier, which is a hash based on the content, you can go and fetch all these different chunks. So that reminds you a bit of torrenting, right? That's the same way that torrenting works. So what's interesting is that the CID is made up of a content hash, so that if the content changes, then the CID changes, right? You get a new CID. So the original CID is immutable, and there's always going to be a version attached to it that's the same version that it was initially. So you can't just have a web page through HTTP where you can change it and people won't be able to get that version back unless they have it cached. That CID will always be linked to the same content, and if the content changes, it'll be a new CID. And then to make it human readable, you can use DNS, just like with IP addresses, to always link to the latest version. So you can have a human readable address that's always linked to the latest content hash. And then if you really want, you can still go to the non-human readable CIDs to get previous versions. So one example of a project choosing IPFS that I thought was really cool is a mirrored version of Wikipedia. And the reason I find that really cool is because I think Wikipedia is a treasure to humankind. And I think if it were to go down for some reason, for any reason, it would be like, the Library of Alexandria. So it would be a huge loss. And to have this mirrored version, of course it's read-only, but to have this mirrored version on IPFS, that's really hard to take down because it's hosted by so many different peers. And if you take down one chunk, someone else is going to be hosting the same chunk. It's really resistant to censorship. And that's becoming increasingly important as the web is centralizing more, because the more centralized the web is, the easier it is for repressive governments to cut off the internet. So, for instance, Russia blocked Facebook and Twitter when it invaded Ukraine. Iran has limited internet access for a really long time already and ramps it up anytime there's revolutionary activity. But also other governments that you might not think that do it, like Poland, they do it. Your own government probably does it to a degree, especially during times of heightened activism. We all are victims of this, essentially. And the internet is an extremely important tool for activists to organize. So I am really excited about any plan to save it in this way. So how can you get involved? You can use apps like federated apps and IPFS. You can teach like I'm doing now, because I get excited when I hear about it. But I can't really apply it in my daily work because aviation isn't really a web thing. But I can still talk about it and contribute in that way. You can build apps. Build apps on ActivityPub. In fact, there is an experimental API platform library, but it's so that the API platform can support the ActivityPub vocabulary, but it's not production ready, so you can also contribute to it. And you contribute to the solid specification, you can contribute to discussions and things like that. So there's lots of things you can do. But before you do that, I want to point you to one last thing. Also a website. If you scan the QR code, Switching Software gives you really good free and open software alternatives to apps of your choice. So a lot of free software and also some federated stuff, alternatives, if you're not sure where to start. But if you want to get involved, I implore you to look at DWeb first, because DWeb is an umbrella decentralized web community centered around the people behind the Internet Archive, which you may know from the Wayback Machine, because they're also moving to IPFS. In fact, they already have a version of the Internet Archive that is on IPFS, so hosted peer-to-peer, because they're also worried that it might, they also find it a treasure trove for humanity and they want to keep it around. But they do acknowledge that tech isn't always the solution to human problems, and in fact can aggravate and exacerbate human problems, as the World Wide Web has with all its good intentions. So their focus is on using principles to build the decentralized web. And there's 5 principles. They're bigger than this, but I want to just go through them quickly, and then you can go read them yourself. So the first one is technology for human agency. So they see the internet as a tool for people to have peer-to-peer communication, person to person, and not through big businesses or anything like that. No hierarchical component. It should empower people to communicate with each other peer-to-peer. Then number 2 is distributed benefits. So everyone who contributes to this decentralized web should reap the benefits. So what you see, for instance, in the crypto space, in my opinion, is that a few early movers started, because it's so centered around currency, even though it started with idealism, early movers could hog wealth, and now it's become more about speculation than anything else. So all it's doing is aggravating wealth inequality, if you think about it. Your opinions may differ, but that's kind of how I see it, and that's, I think, a good example of not taking some of these principles into account. Number 3 is mutual respect. So you have to organize your tech in a way that fosters mutual respect, and that means, for instance, that you have a very clear code of conduct, and that also users follow that code of conduct. 4 is humanity. So the web should focus on equality, on equity, on human rights. And it should empower people, but especially those who are marginalized and oppressed. So we have to recognize how our tech can do harm and build in mechanisms that do harm reduction and avoid exploitation and things like that, because we don't want to aggravate any problems. And then last but not least is ecological awareness. So not only do we want to build systems to minimize harm to the environment and use very minimal resources, but especially in hardware, we want to make sure that our users have the right to repair. We want to make sure that users can buy something and use it for years and years and years, and not buy something, not know how to repair it, throw it out, get the newest gadget and things like that, and then just fill up the earth with all this electronic waste. So if you want to look in more detail at these principles, they're really well written, much better written than I can convey them now in such a short time. So definitely check them out. And again, I want to stress that their aim is to go back to the web that Tim Berners-Lee intended. And that's not something that they made up that he wanted. He's quite vocal about that, and you can actually Google that and check. You don't have to believe me. He intended for the internet to be a highly political tool, and a tool to empower people and to ensure equality for all people. And I think we have a chance at a do-over, and that is possibly very bright and exciting. But as we're building this new thing, we need to always remain critical. It's really important to not get too swept away, to not get too excited. There's a fair few concerns I already have with some of the technologies that we talked about today. It's really important to keep asking the hard questions, even though you're super excited about them. Think about possible downside of the technology you're building. Think about possible harm it could inflict. And also consider that maybe this great idea that you have shouldn't be built. Not every great idea has to be built if there's no way to mitigate harm. And I think if we keep that in mind, the future of the decentralized web could be a lot more bright and exciting than the dystopian dumpster fire that we have now. Thank you so much.